2 years after Folkways Records founder Moses Ash passed away, arguably the most influential recording catalog fell into the capable hands of Smithsonian Institution. Along with the newly appointed Smithsonian Folkways Director Tony Seeger, Jeff Place was among the most qualified candidates for the job. At Kenyon College, Jeff spent much of his time as a DJ at the campus radio station and graduated with a degree in psychology. He then went to grad school at the University of Maryland, where he studied library science with a specialty in media archives. However, this monumental task was unlike anything Jeff had done before, archiving the most diverse catalog of recordings ever put together, over 2,000 albums, nearly all of which were in unmarked boxes or simply labeled folk songs. Jeff refers to this discovery as his Rumpelstiltskin moment. Quote, "I walked into this giant room full of boxes stacked to the ceiling everywhere, and that was Folkways." For Jeff and his team, it would take most of the 1990s to organize and digitize this massive collection. Since then, Jeff has been involved with over 60 compilations of artists and compilations and re-releases of artists like Leadbelly, Pete Seeger, and Woody Guthrie, among many, many others. He's also co-produced and wrote the liner notes for the acclaimed 1997 edition of the Anthology of American Folk Music. Jeff is now the curator and senior archivist of the Ralph Rinsler Folklife Archives and Collections, which includes 12 record labels that are now part of Smithsonian Folkways recordings. Jeff has been nominated for 12 Indie Awards, 8 Grammys, winning 6 Indies and 3 Grammys. Let's give a big welcome to our keynote speaker for the 2023 SERFA Conference, Jeff Place.
Everybody. Good morning. Yeah, well, Folkways Records and Smithsonian Folkways just celebrated the 75th anniversary a few days ago. And I've been part of it for 36 of those 75 years. So what I'm charged with, I guess, is telling you the story, you know, from kind of the beginning up till now and kind of what Smithsonian Folkways is, because it's a record company, but it's also a collection. It's an educational entity. It's not like a lot of other folk record companies that you folks know. It's far more than folk. I mean, starting the tradition of Folkways, where you put out Sounds of Frogs records and railroad trains and Martin Luther King speeches and Woody Guthrie and Mary Lou Williams and tribal music of Borneo. Like the original Folkways put out almost 2,200 albums, the equivalent of about one a week for like 40 years. It was insane. And I, as Nicholas said, I kind of came into this giant room full of all Moses Ash, who was the founder of Folkways, his stuff in boxes. I remember seeing this one box. I opened it up, and there was a laundry receipt, one black shoe, and a Time magazine, and then the bottom there was a folder with lyrics handwritten out by Woody Guthrie. And I had to kind of go through a lot of this stuff for years and unfortunately Mo had passed away 2 years before I got there, so I didn't get able to talk to him about this stuff. But going back to the beginning, Moses Ash was originally from Poland, and his father was a well-known author named Sholem Ash, who wrote novels in Yiddish. Anyway, he was running a sort of a radio repair biz in New York City in the 30s, and setting up PAs, and somewhere along the line, some of his neighbors they wanted to get 78s of Yiddish singers in the area, and no one was putting that kind of music out, so he kind of filled that niche and started putting out Yiddish records. And then somewhere along the line, he decided to put out a record of French poets, and then Leadbelly came along, he put out Leadbelly. Next thing you know, he's in the record business. So he had a label called Ash Records that existed through the 40s. It put out a lot of Woody, Leadbelly, Mary Lou Williams, you name it, Langston Hughes. And that went out of business. Then he had a record label called Disc, which had a lot more jazz kind of titles on it. He had the misfortune of paying a whole lot of money to put out a Nat King Cole record, and then it sold a ton of copies, and then he had to change his business model to handle demand of a big seller, and then the next record sold his usual 3 copies. He had to lay everybody off. The company went out of business. So he and Marion Disler, his partner, formed Folkways in '48 on May Day, which is typical, a good day for folkways. And he proceeded to put out 2,168 albums over the course of his career. But the famous story is that, his father, Sholem, was friends with Albert Einstein, and he asked Mo to go down to Princeton to visit Einstein, because Einstein wanted to record a message that could be copied and sent to Europe to encourage Jewish people in Europe to leave, to get the heck out of Europe. And they make these discs and send them off. So far, I've never turned up one existing anywhere still, but this was a story. And so he went down to record Einstein, and Einstein said, well, young Mr. Ash, what are you doing with yourself? And he said, well, I want to create this encyclopedia of sound, of the sounds of the world. And Einstein encouraged him, said, that's a great idea. And his dad, who'd been poo-pooing, what do you want to do that stuff for? kind of bite his tongue, But that's the story, the Genesis story, I guess. And so he went on to record this, and the big thing about Folkways is he called it Folkways Records and Service Corporation. And the Service Corporation was, one of the core things was education. He always had all these long booklets, and he would show his records. And then there's really heavy covers and things. And they were meant to be sold to libraries and universities, schools, things like that. You wouldn't find a lot of Folkways records in record stores. I remember I ran a record store in the 70s in DC, and we had maybe 5 or 6 of the big selling titles, but there's the other 2,000 some odd that no one other than schools were getting. And the educational thing, so he spent a lot of his time going to educational fairs, talking to teachers. And maybe, a herpetologist like Charles Bogart comes who says, I need 30 copies of a record of my frog noises for my class. Will you press it for me? He said yes. So he'd press 100, and the other 70 keep in the catalog for years. And like most Folkways records, it'd sell 2 a year. So he had a pretty good stock for a long time. When I came on there was these 2,000 titles, and I looked at the sales, and I think that it was about 20 that sold more than like 5 a year, and everything else was 1 or 2. So his business model were to run very small amounts of things and then sell them, as they were needed. So he had this great career and all these amazing, historical recordings like all the Guthrie stuff. Guthrie would come into his studio and just sit down, and one day he came in and recorded 70 songs. And he gave him a check for $25, and he left, And when I came in, they did, Mo would say released, maybe 3 or 4 78 albums of Guthrie, but there were literally hundreds of extra tracks sitting on glass discs. So I sat in there copying them off these turntables onto digital audio tape at that point. And the same thing with Pete Seeger and Leadbelly, all these people. There was just maybe 5-6% of what was in that collection had ever come out before. So I spent like a lot of my career doing that, getting this stuff out, these box sets. So I'll tackle a section of the catalog, and then after I'm done, I figure I'm kind of like the archaeologist who went digging. I publish my findings. So a lot of these box sets are kind of like the Pete Seeger box set. There's like 70 records came out on Folkways by Pete Seeger, and there's about 500 extra tapes of reels of concerts and other things. I listened to all of them. When I was done, I selected 6 CDs worth of stuff, and the photos, the letters, So Smithsonian Folkways, the stuff we do, it looks like, the Smithsonian thing, it's like an exhibit. You have like a book, 12 by 12 book, and you have what might be a panel and an exhibit in there, and then you have the CDs, and you do stuff with it. Well, as Nicholas said, Tony Seeger, Pete's nephew, and I were the 2 people they hired when Folkways came to the Smithsonian, and had to kind of create a new record label out of it. And I had this experience working in the record store, buying records for a chain, so I actually knew the Rounder people and Bruce from Flying Fish and Chris from Our Hooley, who, for people who know Chris Strachwitz, I found out this morning he passed away yesterday. He was somebody I worked really closely with. I knew he was sick, but anyway, so I introduced them to Tony, and Tony, who was an anthropologist, learned how to be a record baron. And so we kind of kept going and started putting these out. So we tried to put out this summer of 1988. The first thing we did, it was tied closely to the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. And that year we had a contingent of people from the Soviet Union, if you remember what that was, who came to the festival, and it was during Glasnost. And we had all these people, and it's funny, they wanted to send these national orchestras, and we said, no, we want like people, normal, everyday people who do their own community folk music. So we brought these people and we got some tapes sent to us and we put out a cassette we sold at our festival. That was our first Smithsonian Folkways release. Then we did a Woody and Leadbelly record, and we kind of kept going. And so somewhere along the line, what happened was there was another guy named Emery Cook who was kind of this crazy inventor. He invented a thing called binaural, which kind of preceded, it was in the early days of stereo. It was a turntable that had a tone arm with two needles on it, and the record had two sets of grooves, like in rows, like it was like parallel, and one went one channel and one went the other. And he recorded things at exact dimensions of the width between people's ears. Everything, his speakers always had to be, everything had to be put in. I went and interviewed him, and he had a lab coat and his little thing in the back. He lived in Connecticut. But he recorded firecrackers and steel bands and things that were like really impressive audio stuff. And his records were like the people with the tube amp audio geeks in their basement. Those are the go-to things were Cook records. And we thought it would fit with the whimsical thing of Folkways. Cook fits fine. Didn't intend on doing much beyond that. And then next thing you know, other people started saying, I heard, well, the part of the deal was with Folkways, so we had to keep everything in print and make it available to the public. That was what Mo said, including records like, there was one record called Speech After Removal of the Larynx. It was the experience of this guy with a voice box. Now, I don't know how often we sell that thing, but we had to have it in print for people, according to Mo Ash. So people like Cook said, well, if you're going to keep all my weird things in print, like he has a record called Noxious Noises called Speed the Parting Guest that he put out. He was a friend of Rube Goldberg, so you want to get an idea of who Cook was, right? So Paradon Records, which is a left-wing label run by Erwin Silver and Barbara Dane, they came to us. And next thing you know, we have other people coming to us over the years, like Fast Folk, Monitor Records, the Blue Ridge Institute label, an Hispanic label called More. And we just kept going. I think, Nicholas mentioned 12. I think we're up to like 19 now, and that's been part of what I've done all these years is, along with whoever the curator, first it was Tony, and there has been a couple people since then, is to go out and find these people who were sort of visionary people who were passionate about putting out really niche records of certain things, but nobody in the world would put that effort into their label like they did. And they were afraid, the people who came along, their kids would dump it all in the dumpster. So we come along, we say, look, if you want to donate this label to us, we'll keep every one of your records in print forever and make the booklets available. So there was a guy, Joe Glazer, I knew forever in DC, who was a labor song guy. He had a label putting out union songs. Got Joe's label. And we got Folk Legacy from the Paydens a few years ago, and our Hooley records from Chris, and a cowboy label from a guy named Scott O'Malley in Colorado, a string band label from Vivian and Williams in Seattle, and we're always kind of looking for more, and it adds to our catalog. Now, a lot of the catalog, when we started, of course, it was putting things out on physical products, and the problem was we took it on right as LPs disappeared the first time. And we had 170,000 LPs in a warehouse and no one wanted to buy an LP. And we had 0 CDs. So we had to quickly make CDs. And we sold off all those records for $0.25 a piece. Now I see them on eBay for $60, for each one. We had to kind of deal with all the changing technology over the years. But the idea is always to get things out, figure out how to do it, how any way we can. So now there's all sorts of ways with streaming and whatnot, digital downloads. But the one thing that at least my soapbox is always to think that we have to. Folkways has always been about the context that goes with the music. We don't just put out records of just music and having a Folkways track on a phone that just says Deer Dance. That's all, you got it, you just downloaded it, right? Do you know who the tribe is? Do you know what a deer dance is in their community? Do you know who the performers are? No. So we have the booklets. So we put the booklets up for free, and we hope those people who are adventurous enough who are listening to that, look at that liner notes and learn about what this stuff is. So for something to be a Folkways record, it kind of has to have those parts to it, as opposed to, say, just someone's new album, the inside's just lyrics. that there's so many record labels that do that. Because a lot of what we're still putting a lot of our stuff out for educational places. And in an ideal world, we want to find some very rich person to come along and endow the thing so we can make all that music and books and stuff available free to schools and universities. So it's out there. Make these people's work live on. Again, we're constantly mining there's two sides of things. There's Smithsonian Folkways is doing new artists and new music. Most of the time, like an example might be, there's a record we did called Our Native Daughters with Rhiannon Giddens and 3 other women. And it was dealing with what it was like for African American women after the Civil War and what life was like. And it had a story, it had history, it had things like that for the liner notes. And we did a thing, a young guy named No Boy, who's Asian, talking about the experience Asian Americans are having now, these days. And so those are kind of the projects. We have a lot of people proposing things. We kind of try to focus on what's something that would fit into the giant folkways story of the past and expand what we have already. So, and again, we collect all these different record labels, and sometimes I'll collect if there's something that's ancillary, say most of the time with our archive, it's small and we want to use it for things. And it costs a lot of money to preserve stuff and copy things and archive it. As we're told constantly by the current archivists, well, can you give me $70,000 to process these boxes? And then we're like, we don't have $70,000. So we have to be really mindful about what we take in. So sometimes I'll go after a collection of somebody who is really important to one of those record labels, an ancillary thing. So for instance, there was a guy named Fred Ramsey who did a lot of jazz records for Moses Ash. He also recorded Leadbelly's Last Sessions, which was one of the first things recorded on reel-to-reel in the catalog. We got all Fred Ramsey stuff. Or I got the Frog guy. We got all his Frog outtakes. And we managed to get, there was for those who remember far enough back, there was a band called the Almanac Singers in the 40s, which were a precursor to the Weavers. Well, they were all mostly famous in that band. It was Lee Hayes and Pete Seeger and Bess Hawes and Sis Cunningham and Mill Lampell. Woody Guthrie was in that band. And there was a guy named Arthur Stern. And he was the guy no one remembers in that band, but he was like the treasurer and secretary of the band. So I get this phone call from Maryland from this guy who was the nephew of Arthur Stern. Says, well, I got my Uncle Arthur stuff out of his apartment in New York. You interested? And I said, Arthur Stern? Yeah. I went over and the guy had all the logs of every place the Almanac Singers played in these little date books. Like I looked up December 7th, 1941, they had a day off. I thought, I imagined they were somewhere and they heard the news and started singing, but it didn't work that way. But that fit into what we were doing. And when I did the Pete Seeger book, I was able to actually find pictures no one had ever seen before, the Almanac Singers, and letters. And there was a thing where Pete Seeger was writing with Arthur back and forth, showing him drafts of his banjo instructional book. And people were commenting in the margins. So the fun thing about working with the collection is, being able to, sit in with this stuff, the Smithsonian. And there's things like for instance, those audio things. I don't think anybody had probably heard those recordings since the 40s until I popped it on. So there was one time in the 90s I was working with the Guthrie stuff, transferring it, and I was working late because I got so into this stuff. I would be sitting there, I'll just do another one. And so I popped this one record on it. It said, this is for me. This is for me. It said on the handwritten. I went, I wonder. So I put it on, and it was Woody Guthrie, the first time he ever recorded This Land Is Your Land. But the thing about that song that some people know is when he wrote it, there were 2 extra verses, which were very political and subversive, that fell out of the all-American version we all know, one about private property and all of that all the writers for years said, no, Woody Guthrie never recorded that. That's just his handwritten thing. I pop it on, and there's one of those subversive verses coming out of this thing. And I was like, whoa. And I kind of went outside to tell people, and everybody had gone home already. But then a week later, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame had a big symposium on Woody Guthrie. And I was able to spoke at that. And I actually said, well, I have a new song to play for you guys. Check this out. So the whole thing when, working for Folkways all these years is like I say, getting the collections out. So, we're not about people come, we have people come in and do research and sit there, in the archive. But we get hundreds of thousands of hits on the internet on stuff we send out. So I want our collections to go out so you folks and everybody can sit at home on your computer and listen to samples and read about it and stuff. Because that's really kind of, what makes it happen for me. But yeah, we're gonna, like I said, we're continuing to keep on, putting out new stuff. We're trying to keep doing all the weird things that Folkways ever did. Like, there's a group called Matmos doing a record right now who do very avant-garde electronic kind of music, but they're creating a piece based on using excerpts from the science records on Folkways, like the frogs. Or there's the sound of the North American rainforest, which legend has it was actually recorded in a shower stall in New York. And they set it up, and then somebody went out to the suburbs and recorded some crickets, and they put it in there, right? And some famous scientist came in and said, "Those are Yankee crickets. They're not Brazilian." So it's a lot's been about, just try to, carry on Moash's work and do our own thing, and trying to, Folkways is the great niche label, but it's not a niche label, it's about 100 niche labels. Taking every weird little place that somebody might want a record of that no company in their right mind would put out a whole catalog of. But there are companies that put out nothing but bird noise records, nowadays. But there was nobody in 1952 doing that. So Mo would had his like 7 or 8 bird noise records, and people who were enthusiasts got to have it. Anyway, so we've gone through a lot of people over there over the years. When it started, it was just Tony and I, and then now I think there might be 40 people working there doing other things. And it's all based on, it's a nonprofit, so we try to get down to 0 at the end of the year, which usually doesn't happen. But if we make money, like we made $3,000 last year, it goes back into a project. Sometimes if we lose, we lose $3,000. We try to aim for the 0, so the Smithsonian doesn't go, "You're costing us money, you're gone." So that's the plan every year. But yeah, it's been kind of an adventure, all these years, working with this stuff. Yeah, hopefully, I probably will retire in a few years. Hopefully they get people in who, still want to work with all this and put all that effort into it. Anyway, so hopefully you know a little bit more about Folkways and the history. But I think that's pretty much, what I have. I could probably riff on this thing forever, because when I had years, I walked around the archive giving tours. I'd walk down the wall and pull out a Charles Ives tape off the wall that Mo recorded and go tell the entire story of the Walden Suite and how he recorded in this one place who the engineer was and blah, 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 blah. I go down the whole wall like that, and hopefully there's somebody to do that. But thanks for having me. Yeah.